As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect, and I am honored and truly elated to be bringing you part 2 in our series of the Theological Underpinnings of Modernity. I know so many of you have messaged me and have asked when is part 2 coming out, which is a testament to the first episode and the strength of the first episode. And it's just always a pleasure to be in conversation with my friend, brother, comrade, and teacher, Professor Zahir Kolia. Welcome back for part 2 to the Malcolm Effect. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing very well. I'm just so thankful to be here, and to anyone who did message you asking for part 2, that's really lovely to hear. Like, God bless you. That's really nice.
Ameen. Okay, so today's episode, we're going to be covering Columbus, apocalyptic politics, and the theological roots of empire. But what I think will be good is perhaps you could take us through a brief recap of the last episode to perhaps help us anchor our discussion today. So, can you briefly re-anchor us from the last episode so listeners can be oriented to today's discussion around Columbus? And perhaps we can tie into that. Why does the conquest of al-Andalus matter for understanding Columbus?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the first part of it, and I'll do it really briefly. So last time we talked, the main thing we were discussing is that like imperialism doesn't suddenly just appear like Big Bang in 1492. And the point I was really trying to make there is that we may mistake an intensification for an origin if we just focus on the 1492 moment and colonization of the Americas. And so the emphasis was really on like what looks like a rupture is actually, and with culminating outward expansion, it's really an expansion of structures that have really been produced, particularly in Iberia itself. And that's why I kept centering and coming back to the conquest of Andalus. And Andalus becomes really important for me because it's where theology, conquest, and capitalism, they get fused or tied together in such a durable way as a particular structure. You could say the colonial capitalist world system as a structure. And that moment's really, really particular and important. And that's usually what gets cut out of the narrative with the focus on 1492 Americas. And why that matters, I think it is really important for how we understand the current moment, which is what you asked as well. And I think if anyone's been even taking a cursory sort of look or listen at the use of language from some of the top US officials, the use of biblical language, biblical prophecy, apocalyptic struggle, divine destiny, this appears time and time again. And the thing for me that's striking is that I don't think this is just some like religious rhetoric to try to placate a particular base of supporters. I think people like Pete Hegseth, like Secretary of War, Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and John Hagee, a very prominent pastor, and just a whole mass of many Christian Zionists, their support to link it to Israel is just like it's seen as an actual spiritual obligation. And this is where I want to connect the importance, going to our last episode as well, in terms of how theology comes to shape broader social, political, economic relations. And with these U.S. officials, seeing the colonization of Palestine being an obligation tied to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, it's really linked to the coming of the end of times, or what's like called eschatology. And when you see or listen to some of the things they say, like Huckabee said the U.S.-Israel relationship, he said explicitly, he's like, it's not geopolitical, right? It's also spiritual. And Lindsey Graham, he also said, he's like warned if America abandons Israel, God will abandon America. And this worldview, I don't want to just like create a straight line from Columbus to this worldview. Like it's gone through multiple different changes, particularly in the 19th century with what's called dispensationalist theology, which what it did is transformed older Christian apocalyptic expectations, which we'll talk about, into a future-oriented political vision where like restoring Israel is really central to the Christian U.S. Zionist conception of sacred history and that notion of the unfolding of the end of times. And the thing that's interesting, Mamadou, with this is like, it's not just that it's coming from politicians. It's like there's a massive, massive, highly organized political base that form their opinions and their sensibilities based upon these theological notions and that are tied to this larger Christian apocalyptic tradition. And Pastor John Hagee, he's the founder of Christians United for Israel. And his organization, it's mind-blowing. He has an organization that has over 11 million members, which is more than the entire Jewish population of the U.S. So for millions of Christian Zionists, like events in Palestine, for example, are not only like issues related to diplomacy, but signs that history is actually moving towards this divinely ordained conclusion. And so for them, the belief that consolidating territorial control in Palestine and fighting an apocalyptic war in West Asia are very literal, right? And they're seen as biblical prerequisites for the end of days and the return of Christ. And the thing that's really important that I want listeners to think about here is like how folks can believe very sincerely that they're living inside and actively bringing about prophecy. And this is something that happens with Columbus that's so important. And so it's really tempting to see the current moment with the use of this type of language about apocalyptic, end of times, prophetic language. It can be tempting to see it as just a modern phenomenon. But the thing I want to think about today is like, what if it's not a really modern phenomenon with U.S. foreign policy being just say like hijacked by evangelical Christian Zionists? I want to suggest like this fusion of apocalyptic theology, territorial expansion, and imperialism. I want to suggest like this is much older and it's been nurtured over a really, really long period of time. And so I think to explore that question, we need to not just look at contemporary American politics, but return, I guess, to medieval Iberia. I think the Crusades are really key, and ultimately Columbus becomes really instructive as well. And he's really he didn't see himself as a secular explorer. He saw himself as an instrument chosen by God to help fulfill biblical prophecy. And this is exactly like Christian Zionist folks like that I mentioned just now. And so again, I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting it's just a straight line from Columbus to contemporary U.S. officials, but really looking how certain theological understandings of things like redemption, universal mission, and divine destiny were like repeatedly reworked and institutionalized and networked through like successive phases of imperialist expansion. And the figures and institutions transform, but I want to suggest like the elements of these deeper historical structures in the Christian apocalyptic tradition really do shape how imperialism like understands itself and how folks understand themselves within that unfolding history. So that's where I see that these elements being important. It's like it's not just a past history lesson. I feel it does inform today and enriches one's understanding.
Thank you so much for that brief overview, and I really think that is a good introduction to anchor our discussion today. And I think offline, myself and yourself continually have these discussions where we're thinking about the theological underpinnings of modernity, capitalist modernity. And I say that it's important. Yes, we both identify as Muslims, right? Yes, we both attach ourselves to particular theological understandings of the world. But I think what's also important is that we are not talking about theology for the sake of theology, which becomes, among many on the left, a topic of taboo, a topic in which they either have a refusal to engage with or deny its necessity of engaging with to understand modernity. And I think effectively what we're trying to say, and I hope that becomes clearer through this episode, that the story of capitalist modernity, theoretically, analytically, politically, and materially, remains incomplete without an engagement with questions of theology. And I think this is where I'm trying to go, and hopefully future episodes will demonstrate that with yourself and also through the work we're trying to do in Vox Umma. But you mentioned the Crusades. So I think it's important, you mentioned the Crusades and people have so many different understandings. Perhaps they think of Salahuddin Ayyubi, perhaps they think about conquest and kind of the Catholic Church sanctioning certain wars. But when you invoke the Crusades, why do you do so? What do you mean by the Crusades? Can you elaborate on that? And also, how are the Crusades then both theological and material, given the kind of framework you're trying to put forward?
Yeah, and everything you mentioned with regards to, I guess, secularism as a sort of mediating sort of force over the left, where the theological really does get written out, or if it does get accounted for, it gets accounted for as just like a moral cover, ideological justification. And as I mentioned in our other episode, like I'm not so convinced by that argument. And the Crusades, I think, as you mentioned, like it gets understood in so many different ways. I think if you talk to your average like Muslim or Christian, even like the way it comes up is just an idea about, you get competing narratives about like religious fanaticism, more or less. But I think to really unpack the Crusades, I think it's really vital and really one of the most, I think, necessary contexts to understanding Columbus's voyages. And it fits alongside our discussion last time around the conquest of Andalus. And with this, I just want your listeners to be really, really patient, because I want to move really slow, because Crusades, what I want to do here is just more contextualize it, more than anything. Okay, so the very first thing I would do when understanding the Crusades is just, again, provide a really broad strokes account to understand that in the late medieval period, like Europe was peripheral. And I mentioned this in the last episode as well. It was not the center of the world. It wasn't the center of the world economy. Economically, intellectually, commercially, Christian Europe was basically on the margins. It was on the margins of this much larger Afro-Eurasian world system that was still completely dominated by Islamic-hid African Asian powers. And so you had long distance trade, you had finance, agricultural knowledge, navigation, I mean, even like astronomy as well. And these were not European inventions. Europe was learning and appropriating their knowledge. And I wrote that short paper for Vox Umma that folks could Google, where I sort of cover all of these things I'm alluding to, so I won't really repeat it too much in that regard. But in this context, then, broad context, okay, Christian Europe is peripheral, and what it wants to do, it wants to move from the margins to the center of the world economy. And as I mentioned, being on the margins here, the Afro-Eurasian world system, it had like 8 regional subsystems with their own major port cities. So it was like a network of these different subsystems that comprise the world system. Europe is on the margins, they want to enter into it. And this is where the Crusades become sort of important. So I don't approach them just like as religious conflicts between Christianity and Islam. I see them as a moment where European Christendom, this is important, like largely it's feudal. And again, peripheral to this world system, they want to insert themselves into it. So they want to insert themselves into an already existing Mediterranean Islamic world system. And religion and faith was like important, but the Crusades are like, they're bound up with these broader material attempts to gain access to trade routes, resources, and political influence that were concentrated elsewhere. And so let me give like more of a materialist or account of what was happening around the first time of the Crusades. So medieval Europe at this time was like economically fragmented, politically fragmented, very much locally oriented. And it had really limited ability to transform agricultural growth into sustained like large scale accumulation. So what they did, like they had long distance commercial trade, but it was really concentrated in luxury goods. So like spices and like perfumes, fine textiles, but they weren't engaged in expansive commodity production. what ends up happening by the late 11th and 12th centuries is Europe starts to experience like really significant agricultural and demographic expansion. So what happens in this context is that feudal social relations constrained how that growth could be absorbed. So wealth remained like basically primarily tied to localized agrarian like extraction and rent-based class relations. So what does that mean? So for example, you'd have peasants produce, say, grain, and they give a portion of that or money in the form of rent to the feudal landlord, right? So what ends up happening through this feudal system with demographic expansion is that you have a series of contradictions emerge. Population growth placed like a lot of pressure on land and resources. You had like ecological limits becoming more pronounced, like soil fertility being exhausted, social tensions deepening between peasants and feudal elites. And these pressures together contributed eventually to what historians will describe as a late medieval feudal crisis. And in the context of this crisis, it's like one of the responses, it's not the only response, but one of the responses Christian Europe had was outward expansion. And this is where the Crusades, I think, become really important, and to understand them contextually, because it's around the late 11th century that the Crusades then draw European kingdoms, and they draw them into wider networks of trade, warfare, diplomacy, and forms of exchange that stretched like across the Mediterranean. So instead of just seeing the Crusades as just like religious conflicts between Christianity and Islam, we can see it as like moments through which like Christian Europe became more closely connected to the wealth, knowledge, technologies, and systems like commercial systems of the broader Islamicate. And these connections, as these connections really deepened over the centuries and trade expanded further, you had towns, they grew in number, and new urban centers started to emerge. And European merchants, they gained greater access to long distance trade networks. They're moving from the margins into this world system. And then what they're doing, these institutions and knowledges, they become absorbed and adapted within Europe. And these developments help lay some of the foundations for later phases of commercial expansion. Okay, so the thing that ends up happening, you have all these, like you had increased productivity gains in agriculture, but it didn't improve the lives of the peasants. So like much of the additional surplus that they produced continued to be appropriated through what I mentioned earlier, through like rent and levies and taxes. And so what he was doing is just enriching feudal elites while leaving the underlying feudal social relations basically intact. So when I say like feudal Europe struggled to absorb its own surplus, I don't mean like there's just like extra wealth or like resources laying around. What I mean is that feudal social relations limited Christian Europe's ability to turn population growth, to turn agricultural expansion and commercial activity into stable and self-sustaining like processes of development. And here's where like agriculture is a good example. Like populations grow, more land was brought under cultivation, but there was limits to how much the land could produce. And we have to remember, feudalism is based on land productivity. So to give an example, when you have populations grow and agricultural systems put in place, what ended up happening over time is that soil fertility just like it declined. There wasn't enough livestock to generate the manure needed to replenish soil nutrients. Lower soil fertility meant lower grain yields. And because you had lower grain yields, this meant less food for animals during the winter. And this has created a cycle. Okay, and so rather than easing pressures created by population growth and declining soil fertility, like these changes, they just like deepen the crisis even more, putting a massive strain on Europe's food supply. And so what this did over time, this created this really big sort of cycle of declining productivity, food shortages, malnutrition, and vulnerability to epidemic diseases. And so what ends up happening is you have a problem of agricultural sustainability gradually becoming a broader social and economic crisis. And as I mentioned, instead of trying to solve these problems by reorganizing production more locally, what the European rulers did is they looked like outward again, right? So if folks remember from the previous episode, we discussed that like the highly skilled Muslim farmers that were in Iberia, instead of actually copying and working from their really complex irrigation technology and mixed agricultural techniques, they just expelled them. They kicked them out, right? And what they did is they converted then those lands into sheep pasture to support a growing wool trade. So what they did, they kept deepening the crisis more and more. And so what they did, they're not able to turn a sustaining growing population dealing with these feudal contradictions and peasant unrest and really move into any form of sustainable sort of growth. And that's where, again, they increasingly just sought solutions to expansions and access to wealth and trade networks that existed beyond Europe. So then bringing this back again from this, so with this in hand, like the Crusades were, they definitely had a big element of faith, right? But motivating and propelling it. But they're also responses to these deeper material pressures and contradictions within feudal Europe itself, right? So this is like I really want to highlight that, because discussions of the Crusades, again, are often just reduced to these antagonisms between Muslims and Christians. If you could explain it just by competing like religious antagonisms, right? But it really misses how the Crusades are part of the process of Europe facing these social, economic, and political crises, and a way to really manage the tensions through expansion. And a thing that's important for this episode more broadly, it's like when you have these growing feudal contradictions, it became really fused with theological language of the holy war, pilgrimage, salvation, the defense of Christendom. They really became at this period entwined with like material ambitions for land, wealth, trade routes, and strategic ports, right? So what happens is you have this like theological and material concerns. They're reinforcing each other, and they're helping to organize and legitimize projects of expansion beyond Europe's borders. And so what this means is that the Crusades, contextualizing them, were part of a broader reorganization of European power through conquest, expansion, and the pursuit for new sources of wealth and influences. And it's important because, like, what this does, it really sets in motion a pattern where theology became really fused and combined with logics of expansion into already existing world economies, instead of Europe creating something from nothing. And the conquest of the Americas is what really changes all of this quite dramatically, as I'll mention with that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that elaborate response, and important. And I think it's important when you think about the motivations for expansion, that yes, whilst there is of course the theological in terms of the Crusades, we also locate that in the wider kind of transformations that are happening within feudal Europe, right? In terms of population expansion, etc. So what we're talking about, I guess, so far, what you have brought us up to is the precipice of the founding or the creation of the capitalist world economy. So as we understand, the conquest of the Americas does not simply enter an existing capitalist world economy, it helps create and set one in motion. And I think you cannot divorce this discussion for how Samir Amin would say the operation of the law of value on the world scale, right? So my question is for you at this point then, is when we think of the law of value, how do you understand that within this framework as well? And secondary to that is, how do cheap food, cheap energy, cheap labor, and cheap raw materials make accumulation possible?
Yeah, and so with this, I think drawing attention to, again, like for instance with Samir Amin and the notion of the law of value, and then when talking about things like cheap natures and cheap food, that draws our attention to like Jason Moore's work and also some of Bikram's work. And I think the law of value becomes really, really important. And the thing for folks, I think that would be helpful to understand when I'm talking about this, when we're talking about this historic shift from feudalism to colonial capitalism, right? And it's that you have this shift where you had accumulation was based primarily on land productivity under feudalism, which what I was discussing earlier. And the shift you get toward accumulation based on labor productivity under capitalism, right? And so when I think about the law of value, I think I draw a lot on Jason Moore's understanding here, because I found it most helpful. And there's multiple different authors who cut into it slightly differently, right? So as you mentioned, like the conquest of the Americas supplied the cheap food, cheap raw materials, cheap labor that allowed capital to really increase labor productivity and to accumulate just like on a global scale. And this is, of course, is where European centers of accumulation, they're the beneficiaries of this process, right? So when, as we see, like as European societies move from a feudal system oriented around extracting rents from peasants and towards a capitalist system oriented around the production of surplus value through the exploitative capital labor relation that most people are sort of used to, you require like vast quantities of cheap or free, like stolen food, energy, labor, raw materials. And this is where the Americas becomes the vast frontier where Europeans could then seize land, forests, rivers, mineral wealth, labor through enslavement. And this and through Bikram's work, you get the appropriation of indigenous knowledge about agriculture, ecology, and the management of these landscapes. So you have like enslaved labor, indigenous socio-ecological knowledge that co-constitute these fertile soils, forests, and rivers, and mineral wealth. They all get appropriated at basically little or no cost to European capital, right? And so what this means is like European merchants and investors and plantations, like they didn't have to pay the full cost of producing or reproducing these sources of wealth. Right, so the labor, ecological restorations, knowledge systems that they relied upon, they're just violently appropriated through conquest, slavery, and plunder, rather than acquired at their full social cost. Right, so the exploitation of wage labor in Europe is completely, like, you can't separate it from the appropriation of unpaid labor and resources in the colonial frontier that lower the cost of production and make accumulation possible. And so that's when the Americas get subordinated or organized by the law of value. It's not just like a military or political project. It's like a world scale strategy of supplying cheap natures that allow capital to reduce socially necessary labor time, increase labor productivity, and expand accumulation. So this is like capitalism is not just like built in a Eurocentric frame, like within the workshops or like factories of Europe. It's necessarily built through the colonial reorganization of land, labor, and nature across an expanding colonial frontier that has to continuously be reconstituted through these different successive phases of imperial expansion, right? So so thinking about the law of value there, it's like you got the sort of dual character exploitation of labor within the circuits of capital, and then you have the unpaid appropriation of work and resources from the colonial frontier. And then those two sort of things combine for global endless accumulation is how I understand these processes, and how it links to the conversation earlier in terms of trying to get out of or resolve the different feudal contradictions that were really hinged upon land productivity.
Thank you. So, given this understanding that capitalism cannot just be reduced to kind of wage labor, markets, exchange, and we understand that out of necessity to solve the contradictions of capital, solve the contradictions between labor and capital within what now is becoming the core, we understand that, you know, there's this need to kind of appropriate and accumulate in the new world, right? So essentially imperialism allows capitalism to move beyond simple reproduction into expanded reproduction. But I guess in this understanding then, why do you think understanding or talking about market exchange becomes insufficient to define capitalism? And again, I guess people will probably be thinking, hang on a minute, this is about theology. Why are we now talking about the law of value? Why are we now talking about capitalism in this way and market exchanges and accumulation and reproduction? So then why does political economy need to be joined to theology here then?
Yeah, okay. So in the first instance, I think talking about the importance of not just the existence of just say like markets or exchange making something capitalist, but this like you're mentioning, imperialism requires not only the exploitation of labor, but this appropriation and the colonial frontier. There's a few reasons why this is really important to orient it in this way. Like, one is to capture colonial capitalism as a process, and so with that understanding, like the colonial frontier is not just like an add-on to capitalism; it's necessary for capitalism to function, right? So the capitalism is, it's not only the exploitation of wage labor, which is how some folks will sort of read it, but it has to like it relies upon the continual appropriation of unpaid work that is not fully compensated through the wage relation. So the bigger point then here is when you define like capitalism solely through things like wage labor and market exchange, it has implications for how we talk about, just say, China today, or Islam, just say more broadly in its history. And this, Mamadou, I remember on Twitter, actually, you put someone on blast for suggesting Islamic societies were capitalist because they engaged in like markets or commodity production, right? And you were saying like, no, like this is completely incorrect. And the idea that I think you were getting at, right, is what is embedded in your question a little bit, right? It's that because like engaging in markets and commodity production doesn't make a society or civilization capitalist, right? Capital is not reducible to wage labor and market exchange or even commodity production itself, right? It's like when we think about it more broadly as a form of colonial capitalism, as a world system whose expansion depends upon the violent appropriation of unpaid work and resources on a world scale, then you can't make these really simple equivocations to say like, okay, now China's capitalist, okay, like Islamic societies in the past are capitalist just because they engaged in market relations and wage capital labor relations, right? And the point is like, without like this massive stream of unpaid appropriated work and resources, the cost of production would rise, labor productivity would fall, and accumulation would slow. And as you alluded to with Patnaik's, right, you get this state of simple reproduction as opposed to expanded reproduction, right? So the bigger point, the important point here is that like every process of exploitation within the wage relation depends upon a faster and more intensive ongoing process of appropriation from the colonial frontier. And why? It's because it lowers the cost of production and allows for that expanded reproduction, that continuous accumulation and economic expansion. So what appears as just say like productivity inside the factory or workplace, that depends upon these like enormous reservoirs of appropriated unpaid work and resources outside of it, right? So exploitation within production is like, you can't separate it from appropriation beyond it, right? And so I think with like on these like multiple levels, why those thinking about capitalism as colonial capitalism as a world system, right? And not just reducible to the capital labor relation or just engaging in markets, right? You start to equivocate and you start to see, again, like your discussion with people saying like Islamic societies are therefore capitalist or China is therefore capitalist and it's bad. And then people throw their hands up in a way. But in sort of the last part of your question too, that you asked is like, okay, so if we're focusing on theology, we're here talking about the law of value, these like maybe Marxist, anti-imperialist debates and stuff. I think what for me becomes important is like, yeah, all of these discussions that we're having so far in a way is that one, it's okay, imperialism has always been necessary for capitalist accumulation, right? And then for me, this is where the story becomes like messy, right? It's like, how did conquest, dispossession, appropriation like become morally legible and politically legitimate and thinkable in the first place, right? Like, how did indigenous lands come to be viewed as available for seizure? Like, how were entire populations transformed into legitimate objects of conquest and conversion in particular, right? And conversion, I will like get into, I hope, it's like, it was always a really big question for me. It's like, if colonial capitalism requires exploitation of labor and the appropriation of unpaid human and like extra human work on a global scale, like why this enormous religious effort around conversion, right? And for those familiar with Moore's work, like he'll point to what's called abstract social nature, which is like the ways in which frontiers are imagined, mapped, rationalized, and captured as zones of appropriation to advance labor productivity. But I'm not I'm not so sure it really captures how theology itself is a driving force that shaped something like abstract social nature within his account. So to answer these questions, like we obviously need a materialist analysis, right? And just to do that materialist analysis, like you could spend your whole life, right? Like what I'm doing on looking like on feudal social relations, it's bewildering when you start to get into those discussions, debates, terminologies. It becomes another really confusing and long-term commitment to work through like world systems theory, to work through decolonial theory. And then when you try to bring in the theological questions into it, at least for me, it throws a lot of assumptions. You start to question how some of these processes function, right? And that's where I think this work in part is important, right? And so, I mean, I already gestured towards some of these processes through the Crusades and the conquest of Andalus. And when we bring a materialist analysis together with the theological, then I mean, we get a different story, right? And this is where like Columbus, we can think about Columbus and then hopefully have time for discussion around like Las Casas as well. You get a really different understanding of these figures and their role. And I think again, like to apologize a bit to the listeners, like there was a lot of backdrop here before getting to Columbus, but I think it's really critical for like actually really understanding the moment from which he emerges, instead of just having these simplistic accounts that, yeah, like Columbus was, a white supremacist colonizer. Like you get these really sort of simplistic formulations about him that really individualize it, right? Which I think is more like a neoliberal kind of move, where you just individualize these things as opposed to locating Columbus within a larger historical process and the emergence and that shift from feudalism based on land productivity to colonial capitalism, which is based on labor productivity, and how it necessarily involves the colonial frontier and these theological structures, epistemic structures as well, that are circulating and shaping him at the time. Like you need all this stuff to really contextualize and clarify what was happening and motivating him, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much. And I appreciate you bringing this point of, when we think of capitalism, right, we're talking about that capitalism, and it by necessity requires imperialism. Otherwise, you will not get the types of reproduction, expanded reproduction that we see today, that what we call capitalism. And I think, just a kind of a side point, I often get into debates with Muslims, again, who take quite reductionary takes when thinking about what did the type of market exchanges in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam entail. And I think oftentimes when people will see the form and be like, oh yeah, that's capitalism, right? And I'm, again,
right,
I can't think, well, I can obviously, but there's not many things I can think of that is disrespectful to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam than to call him a capitalist.
Absolutely.
Because I can understand, and I guess, in the tradition that we come from, that we make 70 excuses for people, we can put it to ignorance, right? But I think it's quite a dire situation when I can understand people who say, you know what, the metaphysical assumptions within Marx are irreconcilable with Islamic theology, be that from the schools of Aqidah, schools of theology, from the Asharis, Maturidis, or the Atharis, right? I can hear that argument, or you can say that, you know what, the way in which socialist states have taken a war against religion or theology as an institution makes me pause as a Muslim to think, can I adopt this as a worldview or a method? I can hear those discussions, and I think this is the task of scholars to work through some of these things. But what I cannot hear is to denigrate the Messenger of Allah by saying that he is a capitalist or that Islam is capitalist, because I don't see that. I don't see how you can read the Quran in which it speaks about, in which there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, you pay the worker before his sweat is dry. Or you see in the Quran this kind of egalitarian call, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not let wealth circulate amongst a few people. Or in our embodied practice, we are told that from prayer, we are told to stand shoulder to shoulder as one body. Zakat is an institution to ensure that this wealth is circulated within society. In Hajj, we are told that we are told that everyone must dress the same to abolish class distinction or differentiation. This is what Islam teaches and speaks to us about. Likewise, the Prophet's final sermon, which he says explicitly, which is for me is one of the most egalitarian messages in any faith tradition, that no Arab is better than non-Arab, no black is better than a white, etc. And this was the message that inspired Malcolm X so far that he said that if America embraced Islam, it would cure the race problem. And again, this is not for me to say that racism, anti-blackness, and other forms of racism does not exist within the Muslim majority countries, because they absolutely do. But I'm saying that at least as an ideal, this is what it embodies. And for me, that is diametrically opposed to what capitalism is and requires, right? Capitalism exacerbates these differences to expand accumulation and reproduction. So thank you for bringing it up, and sorry for going on that tangent, but I think it's quite important.
No, it's really important. If I can just
yeah, of course,
add one element here too, in terms of thinking about within the Islamic tradition, like rivers, trees, like nature being like signs, being like ayah, right? And also as a really important point that links to Moore's intervention is that the nature or the world is not just matter waiting for human use, right? Rather, it's a living field of relations, which I think the concept of Tawheed really captures, right? And that unity, and that really, I think that notion of Tawheed, which is quite essential, right, is that it differs from that Cartesian dualism that Moore identifies, where he says this ontological relation where humans view nature as something that's passive and can be mastered, right? And it's it confronts this external object that it sees as nature. And what Moore talks about is capitalism depends upon this abstraction of nature as an external domain, where within the Islamic tradition, it doesn't do that at any point, right? The idea is that humans and nature are co-constituted within a relational web of interdependence, right? So within that, I think in Islamic ontology, you're not going to see nature as this external thing that you can just act upon, that this is inert object, right? There's ethical frameworks that punctuate that process. And it's the same thing with long distance forms of trade. And I mentioned it in that Voxama article as well, the way trade relations would take place with long distance partnerships that the Venetians ended up appropriating in the form of the Comendia, which ended up sort of driving early capitalist relations. They appropriated from the Muslim Qirat. And that it was based upon the Muslim long distance partnership forms were based upon and ordered by an ethical moral form of authority, right? Where sincerity, truthfulness, friendship, these elements were so central to how that particular long distance partnership trade form would take place. It was horizontal. And what the Europeans and Venetians end up doing is they turn it into a vertical relationship with a wealthy investor putting forward the capital, and then you have a poor merchant or factor carrying out the trade. Whereas much more equalized in the Islamic tradition and mediated by that form of authority. And the Pednaics, they even mention this, right? In terms of authentic commodity production within more of a capitalist social relation, it erodes, it becomes impersonal. That's one of the subtle factors of it. It's an impersonal relation. Whereas within the Islamic tradition, the relationships, even through trade and merchant networks, it's not an impersonal relation. It's very much mediated by an ethical and moral form of authority. And so, yeah, I agree. You get these really simplistic equivocations, right? Markets equal capitalism. Therefore, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was capitalist. Astaghfirullah. These sort of really cheesy, straightforward assertions that are just they're incredibly lame, and they just obscure the debates and us moving forward and actually thinking about developing how we can think about these different historical processes, understanding the law of value and how Islam has particular answers to it, right? And not to subsume the Islamic tradition back into this history of colonial capitalist modernity, right? It's a really sloppy move. It's garbage.
Absolutely, and we're definitely aligned on that. Okay, so I'm guessing once again people will be thinking, okay, what does Columbus have to do with all of this? And we hear, was it 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? We hear it in these kind of idioms, or how people speak about Columbus. And it is this presentation as if he's a wanderer, an explorer in really secular registers, right? So I think the following questions I have is, what does Columbus have to do with all of this? And perhaps if it's worth speaking or mentioning or going through, who was Columbus? Like, did he think he was discovering a new world? And again, why is it misleading then to treat Columbus as just some wanderer or secular explorer?
Yeah. Okay. So we've had this long discussion, feudalism, capitalism, law of value. And it's like, yeah, what does Columbus have to do with any of this stuff? Right. So I think for listeners, thinking about, once we see how theology, conquest, and like capitalism are already bound in Iberia, and how the Crusades are part of the story, with the larger feudal crisis, part of the thing the listeners can think about is, in the processes we just described, is what sort of like subject emerges from the world we just described, right? For me, it becomes a question of subject formation and knowledge formation. So in all this stuff we just been discussing, world economy in the medieval period, Europe wants to enter into it, feudal crisis, Crusades. You have these processes, and then you have colonial capitalism emerge with the colonial frontier of the Americas, and thinking about like what kind of subject, right? What kind of imagination would this world produce? What kind of person can act inside of this structure and believe very sincerely that they're fulfilling God's will? And this is where Columbus becomes such a fascinating figure, right? And then, as you mentioned, Mamadou, you get these like these like romantic accounts, like Columbus sailed the ocean blue, like his statues, he discovered the America, all of the stuff we know in dominant narratives about him, right? And Columbus, and discussing him, and why the importance of everything we just discussed, is that Columbus doesn't just like pop out of nowhere, right? He doesn't rupture medieval thought, and he certainly doesn't represent the birth of secular modernity, right? Columbus is a product of the world we've just been discussing. He's a product of Crusade. He's a product of the conquest of Andalusia, right? And as I'll mention, like, he's a product of apocalyptic Christianity, right, which we'll discuss, and he carries it westward. So to understand him, we have to really stop thinking of Columbus as that typical way, like you described, just like primarily as a navigator or an innovator, and we should be thinking more about him as a millenarian figure. And what do I mean by that is that, like, Columbus believed history was moving toward like a divinely ordained final stage, foretold in biblical prophecy. And for him, his like own actions, that is like exploration, conversion, and the acquisition of wealth for crusade, was like helping to bring that age about. And for in most like decolonial, post-colonial accounts, like the theological dimensions of him are essentially bracketed out, right? It's more about like sort of the violent relations with indigenous peoples, extraction of resources and wealth, right? But like, what is really sort of shaping him? Like, you can't reduce it to he was just like a racist, and I'll get into that, right? And when you were asking like who, just like, who is he, right? Like this just like sort of basic question, and he's such a like a figure within the Western, like, guy's global imagination, right? And the thing that I think the very first thing to understand is that Columbus, firstly, did not believe he was discovering a new world, quote unquote, new world. This is really important. He believed he was completing an old one, and I'm going to clarify what I mean by that, right? And when you do look at that question, like, who was Columbus? The thing that's interesting, you'd think there would be like just multiple really detailed biographies of him, but his past is actually really elusive. It's hard. It's actually quite hard to pin down. Mostly what we know about his early life comes from two main sources. Like, there's a biography written by his son, Ferdinand, and then Bartolome de las Casas also has his account. So these two secondary accounts, and the thing that one immediately can flag that I thought was quite interesting when working through him was like they both suggest that Columbus studied at the famous University of Pavia in Italy, and that detail would like seemingly situate him within elite intellectual circles, right? But historians, when they've really looked deeply into this, they cast serious doubt on that claim. And what Pavia actually turns out, it wasn't a university at all that he attended, but a thing called Vicolo Pavia, which was an alleyway in Genoa. And what that alleyway housed, it was like this modest school run by the Wool Workers Guild. And Columbus's father was actually a wool maker. So that's the kind of school that would have been accessible to him. Why is this important that he studied in an alleyway as opposed to a university? Is that he was not like a university-trained humanist in the Renaissance mold, right? He didn't study classical Greek and Roman texts. He didn't study rhetoric. He didn't study philology. He didn't study philosophy. He didn't study law. His worldview emerged from maritime experience, crusading logics of Christianity that were circulating, biblical prophecy, and the apocalyptic religious culture of the late medieval, like Iberian period, which I mentioned before. Like feudal crisis, you had a bunch of these sort of apocalyptic notions or narratives that emerged during that time in light of that feudal crisis as well. So anyways, what I'm trying to suggest is like he was really largely self-taught, right? So his education, you have in one sense this Wool Workers Guild alleyway education, and then he has merchant networks, he has navigational circles, and he's reading these compilations that were quite accessible and circulating around the late 15th century. So he read an annotated version of Pierre Dei's Imago Mundi. He absorbed fragments of Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and even Ibn Sina. Right? And one examines, like historians note, that his notes were like really scattered and uneven and basic and pretty simplistic, right? So not indicating that he had this deep education. So like most Christians of his time, he read scripture really devoutly, and he didn't read them just for spiritual edification, right? What he did is he read them as authoritative proofs for like his enterprise. So like that's where I was linking it early to start off the episode. Like much like Christian evangelical Zionists today, they don't just read the Bible for that spiritual fulfillment. They see it as actually like authoritative structuring proofs for their actions on a geopolitical scale. And this is important because Columbus's imagination, it wasn't secular. It wasn't some proto-scientific in the way that popular narrative suggests, where again, he's trained as this humanist, right? It's really much more saturated and structured by the Christian apocalyptic tradition and the idea that history unfolds according to divine design, and that it moves forward towards the final like redemptive climax, right? And again, like this is a really important point because again, it opens to sort of the opening that I was trying to make around U.S. officials that are really similarly shaped, right, by the structuring logic of the Christian apocalyptic tradition. This idea that history is unfolding according to a biblically sourced plan, and it's going to lead towards this redemptive end of times, right? And so for Columbus, like biblical prophecies are not metaphorical language for him, right? It's literal, right? And so it completely structures his sense of time. It structures his sense of geography, and it really structures his sense of purpose, right? So he believed he was living inside of prophecy, and that he was an instrument to fulfill prophecy. And I'd argue figures like Hegseth, Huckabee, and Hagee, and other U.S. evangelical Christian Zionists are in a similar mold. They see themselves as like real instruments to fulfill prophecy. And so that discussion, like sort of about his past and his education, is quite important in that regard. And again, it's pretty elusive, actually, which is interesting.
Thank you for that. So are you essentially saying then that Columbus wasn't primarily motivated by exploration or commerce, but by an apocalyptic vision of history? And then how do we then link Granada into Columbus's westward voyage? And to tie into that further, if his voyage is eschatological, how did he see the indigenous peoples he encountered? And I think you kind of gestured to it before when you spoke about conversion. How does or why does incorporation rather than exclusion become so dangerous? Sorry, I put a lot there. I hope you can work through that.
Yeah, let me first sort of work through him. Yeah, him not being just say like motivated by some secular sort of proto-scientific set of ideas related to like just navigation and exploration, but very much tied to the Christian apocalyptic tradition. And this is a point I was like really trying to emphasize earlier, right? And that what's largely missing, I think, from decolonial and other accounts of Columbus when we're putting together this theological account and underpinnings of modernity, right? So two figures become really, really important for Columbus, and where he really acquires and gains familiarity with the apocalyptic Christian tradition. They're, to my knowledge, they've never been like even mentioned in decolonial world systems accounts of colonial capitalist modernity. The first figure that's really important is this person called Joachim of Fiore. And Joachim was this 12th century Calabrian monk who developed one of the most influential apocalyptic frameworks in medieval Christianity. And Joachim's like his theology, what's really interesting, Mohammed, it's like it represented a major shift from earlier Christian approaches to the apocalypse, and especially those shaped by Augustine. So in the Augustinian tradition, the idea of apocalypse was actually more of an allegory about the soul's internal battle against vice, and that symbolized this like broader struggle for salvation, right? That would be like more closely aligned with the idea of like jihad al-nafs, right? Like the inner struggle against inner struggle of the soul, like against vice, right? And that right, so that like that's sort of like that's how the Christian apocalyptic tradition from the through Augustine, it was more understood in that way, right? The thing that's so fascinating is that Joachim, he does something really kind of novel and different. He reads prophecy as unfolding through actual historical events, right? So he believed history itself to move through divinely ordained, like ordered stages, with some prophecies already fulfilled and others still waiting to happen. And this meant the apocalypse was no longer this inward struggle against the self, as in the Augustinian tradition. It became something that could emerge within history itself. And this is why this figure is so important. And what he does is that he divides history into three ages or stages. He says there's the age of the Father, and he associates that with the Old Testament. He says there's the age of the Son, and that's associated with the New Testament and the Church. And he says there's this age of the Holy Spirit, which is this final sort of epoch of universal conversion, spiritual renewal, and a fulfillment of like sacred biblical history. So for Joachim, and he was a Franciscan, and in the first episode I talked about the distinctions between Franciscans and Dominicans, and he influenced a lot of Franciscans. And his idea and those influenced by him, the notion was this final age of the Holy Spirit would not emerge like symbolically. It would actually come through concrete historical events. And there's very specific historical events that he and these post Joachim thinkers talk about. And one of the big ones was the defeat or subjugation of Islam. This is very much on their minds, right? The liberation of Jerusalem for them, and then the rebuilding of the temple. So like the recovery of Jerusalem during the Crusades was, for medieval Christians, was much more about restoring Christian control over what they saw as sacred lands and holy sites associated with Christ's life. And so with this, they also were, the other concrete historical event was a conversion of all peoples in the world to Christianity. So for them, the end of the world is not going to happen until these concrete historical events occur. And when you read Joachim and others, it's like they come up with really fascinating like mathematical equations to say this is going to happen within 132 years. They do all these like really interesting prophecies using math and stuff. And these events, again, are not spiritual metaphor. It's like historical prophecy manifest through events. And so Joachim, like he interpreted world history itself as moving towards an apocalyptic endpoint. And political events, wars, conquests, religious expansion, you could understand a subject within this particular worldview, he understood them and read them as signs that sacred history was unfolding in real time, right? And this is why Joachim matters so much to Columbus, right? So Franciscan networks were really deeply shaped by Joachim's thought. And Columbus then came to believe that his voyages formed part of these events or these sequences or unfolding to the age of the Holy Spirit. And for him, when you mentioned the conquest of Andalus, like the conquest of Andalus, the westward expansion into the Indies and the conversion of non-Christian peoples, and also the acquisition of gold for him were all like stages in the coming final age of the Holy Spirit, right? And Columbus, the thing that's interesting to know is like he absorbed this vision directly through Franciscan circles. Like his closest associates were Franciscans. He prepared his initial voyage, Mamadou, in a Franciscan stronghold, right? And he patronized Franciscan monasteries. Like he was deeply, deeply networked into the Franciscan like sort of theological like world. And Joachim was really, really key, right? And so he moved within networks really shaped by like Joachim's apocalyptic expectation, right? So in short, like he was very much shaped by this tradition, right? And so when saying like he wasn't primarily motivated by things like commerce only or exploration, which is typically understood, but you see with Joachim, like he's getting actually very much deeply influenced by this apocalyptic vision of history that took a turn from the Augustinian tradition to see the apocalyptic tradition manifesting through concrete historical events, right? And it's like commerce and empire like mattered a lot, right? But the thing to understand, I think, for these accounts is to like embed those materialist, like maybe like commerce and imperialism within this prophetic worldview, right? And when you do that, one, Joachim becomes really important. And the second major figure, I mentioned him, was Pierre Dei. And Columbus came across most of Joachim's thought through him. And Dei was a 14th century French cardinal, and he was also like a theologian and a cosmographer, meaning like he tried to map the entire structure of the world and cosmos as part of like a unified divine order. They see everything moving according to a particular plan, right? And so his work really shapes Columbus's imagination. So his Imago Mundi, or Image of the World, when one looks at Columbus's books that have survived, like it's one of the Columbus's most heavily annotated books. He read this like really, really heavily, would copy out a lot of the passages. So he's deeply influenced, and we know by like empirical evidence. Like we don't need a positivist relation to necessarily confirm this, but this is something that's important to note, right? And so what makes Dei so important is that he really represents a late medieval Christian worldview before like the modern separation of science, religion, like geography and politics. Like for Dei, all of these domains are not separate. They're not distinct. Like astronomy, sacred scripture, geography, and apocalyptic prophecy, they all form like a single intelligible Christian worldview or cosmos, and it's all being governed by like divine providence, right? And so when Columbus like read geography through Dei, like he's not reading maps in like a modern secular sense as like neutral descriptions of physical territory, typology. He's not looking at maps in that way through that lens, right? For him, like geography is completely inseparable from salvation history. And this is where things like epistemology become important to account for in materialist analyses, right? And for Columbus, like thinking about geography, like the distribution of peoples, the spread of Christianity, the defeat of Islam, the recovery of Jerusalem, and the approaching apocalypse were all interconnected moments within the sacred history, right? And this is why Dei mattered so much to Columbus. So like, as historians know, Dei effectively provides Columbus with summaries of both the physical like cosmos and its like connections to like eschatology, right? And this point is so crucial because Columbus didn't think he was like overthrowing medieval theology or like inventing a radically new worldview. Like this is like he thought he was just fulfilling prophecy, right, within an already existing Christian cosmological order. He's not, again, this innovative proto-secular navigator just solely concerned with commerce and exploration, right? Like he's very much like, one has to try to get into the worldview, right, at this time and think about this, right? And like decolonial thought will often, foreground like empire, race, global epistemic hierarchies that privileges European ways of knowing and being. And like, yeah, like that's that extent, that's right. But it really, I think, like underplays the structural role of Christian eschatology in the apocalyptic tradition. Like it really doesn't mention them. And to my knowledge, like world systems doesn't at all mention these things, right? But they're really key. And so figures like Joachim and Dei, they don't appear in these decolonial narratives, but like I think without them, you can't really grasp how Columbus understood conquest, conversion, like wealth, and even just like the notion of time itself, right? So when in 1492 in January, Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, right? The last Muslim polity in Iberia. And I discussed this in the last episode, right? Columbus witnesses the banners raised over the Alhambra, right? And what he sees when the banners get raised over the Alhambra, like he's looking, he's like, yes, he's like, this is like prophetic confirmation, right? Granada was not just like some military victory. And this is really important to understand. Like for Columbus, he's looking at this, right? And he's like, this confirms like the first stage in sacred history unfolding towards the time of the Holy Spirit as articulated by the prophetic tradition by Joachim, right? So, and this is confirmed because when one studies the letters to the monarchs, like Columbus explicitly links their victory over the Moors or the Muslims in Iberia to his own westward voyage. Like he invokes Joachim's prophecy, and he's writing, it's like the one who will rebuild the temple of Mount Zion would come from Spain. And he expresses his desire to secure converts for an apocalyptic fight with Islam. And this is like entwined then with Spain's larger desire to resolve the feudal crisis that we discussed and launch Spain from its location in the semi-periphery of the world economy. Like you have all of these sorts of things working kind of simultaneously, right? So he sees Spain as chosen, and he sees himself again as an instrument. And so his westward voyage is not some exploratory curiosity. It's like an eschatological or end of times like acceleration. He wants to gather wealth, especially gold, and he wants to do this not just for like accumulation in a capitalist register. He wants to accumulate gold to fund another crusade against Islam. This is like key in his mind. And what he wants to do is he wants to secure converts to Christianity. He wants to bring them back to Iberia, and he wants to prepare for a final confrontation with Islam, because that's where the prophecies have to become fulfilled so history can move towards closure, right? So here, these are like these haunting parallels that we see today. Like Christian Zionists see the U.S. as a chosen instrument, right? That the U.S. is a superpower chosen by God to facilitate the restoration of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland and bring about like a redemptive eschatology or end of times. And folks are familiar with that narrative with contemporary Christian Zionists, right? But like for Columbus, it's like his westward exploration promised these like millenarian possibilities, like the like meaning like these apocalyptic hopes tied to the coming for the final age of Christianity was in part like expanding Christianity geographically, but also launching this pincer assault on Palestine, east and west. And what they wanted to do is squeeze Islam from these trade networks in the Mediterranean, right? So, and this is what I call in the colonial capitalist millenarianism in my forthcoming book, where I'm working through all this stuff, right? So the thing I'm trying to really emphasize here is that like clearly, very clear, the theological and the material, like you can't separate them, right? And the conquest of Andalus like really weakens Islamic commercial power in the Mediterranean, right? But what it does, it really also fulfills prophecy, right? And the expulsion of Muslims and Jews and the conquest of Andalus is both, it's like two things. It's like religious purification, but it's like political consolidation. You have like gold funding crusades to which does like a couple of things, like it fuels accumulation, but also this vision of bringing forth the end of times, right? So what we can see is that all of these things like navigation, conquest, conversion, they're all like embedded in this larger like apocalyptic and eschatological sort of design. And really like Columbus thinks he's standing at the threshold at the age of the Holy Spirit via Joachim, right? So, I mean, just to sort of wind down, when we ask like, okay, who was Columbus, right? He wasn't merely a Genoese sailor. Like he wasn't just like some ambitious merchant. He wasn't just some explorer. And he wasn't just like merely like a white supremacist colonizer seeking to extract wealth and land. These are all like really reductive. Like he was more accurately like a person convinced that he's living inside a particular Christian prophetic and apocalyptic tradition, really concerned with the end of times or eschatology. It's meant to gather souls. It's meant to acquire gold to fund crusade and bring about the end of history itself, right? So this is where when we ask it, it opens up really fruitful avenues for us to really think about the co-contamination or the co-imbrication between the theological and the material, right? And for me, you can't separate them. Like it's like very, very clear, right? And now you asked another, yeah, but let me know if this. I know I went a while on that.
No. I think that's important. I think that. I mean, do you want to wrap up the thought before I ask my next question?
No. That's yeah. I'm good with that. I think you were asking.
We can go into a bit more about conversion and exclusion, because I think oftentimes, well, first and foremost, the story of Columbus is always paired with the relationship to indigenous populations that he encountered, right? And a lot of the dominant narratives we kind of see, a lot of dominant narratives we speak about is this radical otherness, or like, you know, this kind of subject-object formation, and that content be given legibility through this encounter. I think what you're gesturing towards through the act of conversion and incorporation rather than exclusion, it does something different. So my question then is, if Columbus is not organizing the world primarily through this radical otherness, what is happening here?
Yeah, this has been one of the questions for me, like I mentioned earlier, that's always like been vexing. Like it doesn't quite, for me, completely fit into the typical narratives within decolonial and like just say world systems analysis. And like with indigenous peoples, it's like thinking about the centrality of conversion, right? It's like, how were they understood by someone like Columbus? Like, were they souls to be gathered? Were they obstacles to be removed? Were they instruments within this prophetic apocalyptic tradition itself, right? And I think, we left off talking about Columbus, where he's very convinced in a very sincere way that he's living inside of prophecy. Granada's fallen, Spain's been chosen according to these apocalyptic prophecies. And the idea, and he feels like history is accelerating towards its final age, right? And he's feels like he's living inside of this moment, right? And so how did he then see indigenous peoples he encountered? And this is what you alluded to. And I really want to slow down here, because I think this is what's, for me, is often really misunderstood a lot in contemporary theory. And most of the theoretical accounts that I came across when I was in graduate school as well, with theories around post-colonialism, anti-racism, etc., is that it tends to frame, and you alluded to this, the so-called colonial encounter through what we might call the oppositional self-other framework. Vanita Seth has a book that I really like, and it details this argument well. It's called Europe's Indians, and she gets into some of the nitty-gritty, but I'll unpack it here. And the story typically goes something like this. And you can tell me if this is like the same story that you've been told typically. And so the idea is like, okay, Europe constructs itself as civilized, rational, and like as fully human. And then the colonized then are cast as primitive, irrational, or less than human, right? And now that framework, it definitely captures something real, and especially in later racial formations. But what it assumes often is that this oppositional structure, the self versus other, is stable across history. And the idea and the problem that I have with it is that it becomes transhistorical. And I would suggest that it's like anti-materialist, right? It's as if like just like the content changes, but the form of self-other just remains a constant. So typically what people will do, they'll be like, okay, you had this self-other distinction or this oppositional imagination emerge with the Greek barbarian distinction. That's often what people will say, like, this is the origin of it. And this is what a lot of decolonial thinkers will do. And then the idea is that eventually that transforms into the Christian pagan distinction, and then the European non-European, and then you have the white and non-white. So here, this oppositional self-other framework, it suggests that colonial violence, it flows from exclusion, right? It flows from the idea of declaring the colonized less than human, right? The thing that I want to question is this notion of starting with exclusion or dehumanization, okay? And I know it will probably sound a little bit counterintuitive, and also for your listeners, like Bikram, he has this interesting article. It's somewhat connected to this discussion it's in Globalizations, and it's called Beyond the Premise of Conquest. And he focused on the appropriation of indigenous life worlds, and basically like indigenous peoples were not just acted upon, but their knowledge was taken and transformed to advance colonial capitalist modernity. And I'm making a slightly different argument here. And the thing that I'm questioning is starting the story of colonial capitalist modernity with dehumanization, exclusion, and appropriation. I think that starting with dehumanization, exclusion, like mischaracterizes or flattens the theological world that Columbus inhabits at that time around 1492 and after in the Americas, right? Because at this moment, the dominant framework for organizing human variation is not yet radical difference. And it's definitely not biological racial difference. Right, the dominant framework organizing human variation at this time is what's like referred to as theological resemblances, and V.O.I. Mudembe makes this point here in his books, and Mudembe is central to, like, for example, Zuba, who's been on your show several times, right? This is like the central interlocutor for him, and so theological resemblances, or we can call it similitude. The idea, like, what is this? It's like, within Christianity, it's the idea that all humans descended from Adam. So this is monogenesis. The idea is that there's one human origin, one shared fall, and one possibility of redemption. Humanity here is organized genealogically, and it's not organized developmentally. So what I mean is that people are not arranged along modern historical evolutionary hierarchies of progress and backwardness. This emerges like much later. Like the very idea of progress, if people read like Reinhard Koselleck, like it emerges within the German lexicon in like around, I think that's like the 17th century. So the idea of like progress hasn't really emerged in this way. And evolution really is a post-Darwinian idea, right? That emerges in like the 19th century. So during Columbus's time, the point that I'm making is that humans are placed within a particular like salvation sequence, right? They're not arranged in any sort of modern evolutionary set of hierarchies, right? You have creation, you have fall, incarnation, redemption, and apocalypse. This is how humans are located within this particular worldview. Like variation, human variation exists, but exists and is understood within a shared sacred lineage, right? And what the sort of point that I'm making is that this produces is a very specific structure of power. Right. And the book of Acts, it says like God has made all one blood of God has made of one blood all nations. And then Paul, and I think it's in Galatians, he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ. And so what does this mean? Right? Christianity, it understands itself like as universal, not because it excludes radically, but because it seeks to absorb and redeem it. Right, to incorporate it into the body of Christ, as it said, or incorporate it into Christendom. And this is what Columbus is trying to do with indigenous peoples, reincorporate them back into Christianity. Like he saw them as wayward Christians originally that were dispersed there from the flood at the time of Noah. And for him and others, like they felt indigenous peoples in the so-called New World, they lost their connection to Christianity. Right, and he's like, we have to bring them back to it. Right. And the thing that's interesting is that like many folks in Iberia believe that Christianity actually reached the so-called New World long before Columbus. And there's legends that the apostles like St. Thomas or St. Bartholomew had once preached there, meaning that in a lot of popular accounts within Iberia in the medieval period and early modern periods, it's the idea that indigenous peoples were not seen as entirely outside of Christian history, but that their populations had drifted from like that earlier revelation, and it became like quote unquote like engulfed with New World like heresies, right? And so what historians also know is like some folks in Spain interpreted aspects of indigenous religious life as like distorted versions of Christianity, right? And there's ideas that crosses were found in places like the Yucatan, and that they would read this as there being ancient evidence of Christian contact, right, with indigenous people. So from this perspective, his mission is not simply like conquest of or exploration. It's very much informed about bringing the supposedly lost or aberrant souls back into the Christian fold, restoring them to sacred history in preparation for the final age foretold in Christian apocalyptic thought, right? And this is this notion of incorporation that becomes really, really important, right? And there's this one descriptor of indigenous peoples that is in Columbus's diaries, and he describes indigenous peoples as having, quote unquote, no religion. And I want to focus on this a little bit because there's some like influential decolonial readings that interpret this phrase as signaling like the emergence of an early ontological hierarchy. So the idea that this notion of lacking religion meant lacking full standing within the category of the human. So there's a few different prominent decolonial accounts that indigenous peoples appear not simply as non-Christians, but as like beings marked with a kind of ontological deficiency or absence that then helps authorize enslavement, domination, and genocidal violence, right? And I think there's something that's important to this argument, but I think it really does risk like projecting later racial logics like back into the medieval Christian world that Columbus was living within, right? So within medieval Christian theology, to say someone has no religion, it doesn't mean that they have no belief, no spirituality, or no sense of the divine. And it doesn't mean that they lacked full human status, that they were dehumanized in like a modern sense, right? And there's a brief point from Ludwig Wittgenstein. I don't know if you've ever read Wittgenstein or engaged with his work, but
only tertiary readings, nothing substantial, nothing that I could feel comfortable to comment on.
Yeah, and you would have came across them and for folks who would engage like to al-Assad's work. So Wittgenstein's really big in Assad's work. So anyways, like Wittgenstein argued that concepts derive their meaning from how they're used within a particular form of life, right? So rather than assuming like words and concepts have universal meanings across like time and space, what he helps us do is that like we need to examine the grammar of concepts, right? The rules governing their use, right? So when medieval Christians said people had no religion, we shouldn't immediately assume that they meant what we mean today by like religion, right? The question is, what did that concept do within a medieval Christian worldview, right? So to say someone had no religion in that period, so when Columbus is saying indigenous peoples have no religion, he means something very specific and straightforward. And it means that they're not Christian, right? It means that they do not yet obey the commandments of the true God. And it means they're not properly ordered within like the Christian path of salvation, right? And this language comes like really directly from biblical exegesis, right? So in the Psalms, it says the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And in the medieval interpretation, the fool here, it's not an atheist. The fool believes in God, but does not live it rightly. So no religion is not like ontological absence. It's understood as theological deficiency. So like the broader point I'm making here is like Columbus is not yet operating through modern biological race thinking, where he just dehumanizes them. He's saying that they're not Christian, and this is a very different claim. He's not saying they're outside of humanity. He's saying that they're inside actually a redemptive timeline, right? They're candidates for conversion. And this is why Columbus is so like dangerous, and the violence that flows from him is very particular. Because once indigenous peoples are understood as human descendants of Adam, all right, their incorporation into Christianity becomes moral obligation, right? And so violence, enslavement, coercion, they're not contradictions to his worldview. They're mechanisms within it. So if salvation becomes the highest good, then coercion can be rationalized as mercy, right? And if history is moving towards universal Christianization, then conquest becomes sacred duty. It doesn't create a moral conundrum when you read his diary entries, right? So like here, the point is that colonial violence doesn't primarily flow from dehumanization and outright exclusion. It can flow through incorporation. The idea that you are one of us, therefore you must become one of us, right? And indigenous peoples get placed in this impossible position. You convert and be incorporated via violent forms of discipline and even enslavement. Conversion here is not opposed to conquest. It's a theological propelling force, right? And so if indigenous peoples resist, then they can be destroyed. So you get salvation through conversion, right? Salvation through coercion, and indigenous peoples have to receive Christianity. They must allow Spanish presence, and they must submit to instruction. And if they resist, it becomes like a form of spiritual failure, right? Rebellious obstruction to divine order. And as a result, they can be put to death. And we talked about this, but in a slightly different way with Anthony Angie. And when we're talking about like Vittoria was a Dominican. And this is what I mean by this incorporative logic. Like Christian theology here is not simply a moral cover placed on top of material expansion. Colonial capitalist expansion is not reducible just to land theft or extraction, right? Although it definitely involves those, right? But it's really also animated by a theological worldview that seeks to redeem and incorporate the globe into a universal Christian order, right? And the idea is that indigenous peoples are not outside of the salvation narrative. They're already inside of it, but improperly aligned, right? And this idea that misalignment has to be corrected and by force if necessary. Now, when one thinks about Christian theology as shaping human interactions in this way, right, and shaping these ontological distinctions that are made, and placing indigenous peoples not outside of humanity, but inside a particular salvation narrative, right, this changes, I think, how we would think about the origins of colonial capitalist modernity, right? The violence at the beginning is not yet grounded in modern, like, evolutionary race thinking or radical otherness or exclusion or dehumanization, I would argue. It's very much grounded in redemptive incorporation. And I think this distinction does matter, right? It's not like just some narrow esoteric debate, because, when Columbus enslaves, punishes, kills, he doesn't see himself violating Christian morality. As I mentioned, there's no moral issue conundrum that comes up, right? He sees himself fulfilling Joachim's apocalyptic prophecy that the age of the Holy Spirit was near. And for him, converting indigenous peoples was part of this design. And again, Columbus wanted to bring these newly converted souls back to Europe to crush Islam, and then again to bring forth the end of times, right? And so you get these sort of you get some of these parallels, I think, with contemporary Christian Zionism, right? And I think folks often get really focused on trying to reveal contradictions of Christian Zionism, how is it that Christian Zionists could advance and defend genocide and death and imperialism when it seems to really clearly violate basic Christian and ethical moral frameworks, right? And then often I find people, and Mamadou, maybe it's different for you, people will often then just call Christian Zionists deranged or evil or something like that, right? But it's not individual pathology, right? It's Christian evangelical Zionists and stuff, they're focused on fulfilling prophecy, right? And that becomes structural in this sense. It's not a collective of deranged individuals, right? I mean, maybe some folks would disagree with me, but I think the key issue, right, is the fulfillment of the Christian apocalyptic prophecy and a salvation narrative. And it has this really, really long, troubling history, right? And so that's why Columbus matters for understanding imperialism, and he embodies this really particular theological logic where expansion becomes redemption, domination becomes care, and violence becomes moral obligation, right? And this world is organized around a salvation horizon. And I think that's why a lot of folks, and it's really confusing for me, and I think a lot of people, is how can you have something like genocidal scale violence be understood as moral obligation? And I think if it's understood within this broader apocalyptic sort of tradition, it makes more sense, right? So, so just to summarize, what I'm trying to argue here is that colonial violence doesn't just begin with seeing indigenous peoples as less than human, which is, I know for many listeners, is very counterintuitive, right? But I would say it's more accurate to say that Columbus sees indigenous peoples as human in the wrong way, and therefore in need of correction using enslavement or death if needed, and as a moral obligation to fulfill prophecy. And this is the theological logic really that Columbus carries with him, right? So when you look at his writings, his letters, and his book of prophecies, we don't leave the story of Andalusia behind. We see this crusading sort of imagination becomes almost global in a sense, right? And this theological logic of salvation becomes really fused with imperialist expansion. And again, I said, I think it changes for me the story of colonial capitalist modernity and how it it looks and how it takes form, right? It's not just a story of like Europeans simply encountering the unknown and they dehumanize everyone. It's a story of Europeans refusing to let the unknown exist in their singularity and plurality. And just like to end off with this, and this is what, thinking about how you also foregrounded, okay, coming to this as a Muslim, right? It's in the Quran, right? The thing that really contrasts what I'm talking about now is the line, the ayah when it goes like, oh mankind, indeed we've created you for male and female, made you into peoples and nations so you can come to know each other, right? The thing that's so striking about this is that difference here is not treated like a problem, right? It's not an issue that you have to incorporate back, right? It's not something to be overcome, assimilated, or dominated, right? It's that difference is a condition for an ethical relationship with others, right? We're different so we can encounter one another. And in that sense, I think it echoes like Fanon and the notion of mutual recognition or love, right? A relationship that affirms then rather erases human plurality. Right. And so it's that relation to difference. And I think within the Christian apocalyptic tradition and how it takes form with the Crusades, colonial capitalist modernity, it sees difference as a problem, essentially. Right. And I think that's one of the core sort of theological planks too of colonial capitalist modernity that's important, and to question starting the story with dehumanization. I don't know if you find that convincing, but
no, I do.
I think it's quite central. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I do find that convincing, but just to kind of thank you for gesturing to that verse, right? We created you so that you may come to know, from nations and tribes, so that you may come to know each other. I think the Arabic is so interesting here, لِتَعَرَّفُوا, which has this understanding of like, it's like this as you quite rightly said, this mutual recognition. At the same time, it's the unfamiliar isn't one to be conquered or dominated, but it's one to be learnt from, in this mutual understanding of learning from each other, so that you may come to know each other, so that you may come to become acquainted with one another, right? And I think that kind of understanding of humanity is what undergirds the Quran as anywhere. I think that's in distinction to what you're saying and how, I guess, Columbus understood and his worldview. I think it's very important that you mentioned that. So, and maybe this is like something that can lay the groundwork for another discussion, right? We're speaking a lot about capitalist modernity as it pertains to the theological underpinnings as understood in Christianity, and maybe we can understand what would it be to posit a different understanding of the world based on what Islam teaches, right? And I think that's the kind of work, once again, that I find quite interesting to do. In kind of undoing paradigms that we've done, okay, we've kind of undone what has come to be just accepted wholesale about Columbus. Another figure that is similarly understood as representing, yes, Christianity, but in a more humane, this kind of humanist way, is La Casas, right? So my question then is, how do we understand these two figures? Whereas if Columbus represents one form of Christian empire, where does the figure of La Casas fit into all of this? And we can talk about, because again, La Casas is understood to kind of creating these kind of juridical forms of understanding or juridical forms of how you deal with indigenous populations. But it's always, especially in the Western liberal academia, La Casas is kind of gestured towards or pointed towards as the figure of the better one. He saw these people as human at least. So yeah, but I know you're going to trouble that paradigm, that narrative. But yeah, please feel free to introduce to the listeners La Casas and how we should read him.
Yeah, and to understand how he's different from Columbus, let me, like, Columbus, just a couple of points on him. Like, one thing that is also interesting that I didn't mention, but I wanted to as well, is that he felt, and he was convinced until his death, that he reached like Asia, and so he reached the Indies, right? The realm of the Great Khan, right? The edge of the known old world. So he didn't think he was discovering like foreign peoples outside of his existing cosmology, right? And so and this is sort of like important because, again, like, this is where it makes sense that he's again assimilating people back into existing frameworks that he has, right? And what ends up happening, like with Columbus, like he's very much committed to his vision, his final will. He maintains like a bank fund where he wants money to go into it to support the future liberation of Jerusalem, right? Till the day he dies, he's like, the recovery of Jerusalem were part of a divine like plan, like moving towards its fulfillment. But what ended up happening before he dies, like he all like most of his privileges and powers that were granted by the monarchs, they strip him away. He gets arrested, he gets removed from his position as governor, and he spends like the final years of his life like begging the crown to restore his titles and rights. And so he died like really isolated and embittered, right, by the very like imperialist machinery that he's like sort of helped set in motion. So like he was just used and discarded, which is interesting. And what I mentioned with Columbus and tying to the previous episode is, again, he was a Franciscan. I just want people to hold that. And you mentioned like Las Casas is so interesting, I think, because like you mentioned, the way he's understood is as like the corrective almost to Columbus, right? Or at least he's better if within like sort of critical circles and stuff. But how he's understood in the popular mind, like when I was in school and stuff, I had like at least one professor say he was like a racist bastard, he said one time. But every other time I encountered Las Casas, he's presented as this great defender of indigenous peoples, right? Like he's presented as a moral conscience of the Spanish like empire, and he's like this Dominican friar who denounced conquest, defended indigenous dignity and their sovereignty, and he really challenged the brutality of colonial rule, right? When you look closer at Las Casas, right, and again through the lens of his Dominican orientation, we find that like his so-called humane defense was actually very much linked to the logic of the Crusades, the expulsion of Islam, and his like real deep fear and anxiety of producing inauthentic Christians. Okay, so what I'm saying is that like to really understand Las Casas, is that we have to sort of locate him in what I call like the shadow of the Morisco. So Moriscos were Muslims in Andalus, in Iberia, who were forcibly converted to Christianity during the conquest of Andalus and the consolidation of like Catholic Spain. And Moriscos became like the object of like massive, like intense suspicion, anxiety, and like loathing hatred. Okay. And the Morisco question was really central in Andalus. And the thing and anxiety that were circulating at this time was like, were they truly Christian? Right? Had they sincerely converted because they're forcibly converted? Or were they secretly preserving Islam beneath the surface of like Christian identity? Right? And this question really haunted post-conquest Andalus and explains like the rise of the Inquisition. And your listeners and yourself, I'm sure, have at least heard of the Inquisition, right? And the thing, when you look into the Inquisition a little bit more, like contrary to popular belief, like the Inquisition wasn't directed at like Muslims and Jews as such. The jurisdiction was actually reserved for Christians, right? But it was Islam that remained its like central preoccupation, because the concern was whether converted Muslims, these Moriscos, had genuinely embraced Christianity or were secretly practicing Islam, right? So in this sense, the problem was not like religious difference, but concealed difference. Had conversion here truly transformed the soul, or had it just produced outward conformity? So the Inquisition emerged as this like mechanism for identifying and punishing suspected apostasy, right? And this was like reinforced with this limpieza de sangre, like the purity of blood discourse, which a lot of decolonial thinkers will talk about, which distinguished old Christians from those with Muslim or Jewish ancestry. And what they were trying to do with this blood purity discourse, it wasn't like proto-bio-racism. What they were really trying to do was just like create a hierarchy of belonging in which ancestry became like a marker of suspicion. If your lineage tied to like a Muslim, then you would be marked in this way, right? But the picture I'm trying to set out is like a society that's what emerges from this type of society that's so preoccupied with conversion, lineage, and the possibility of outward conformity that might conceal inner treachery. Like the Spanish Inquisition, it not only concerned itself like with obvious unbelief, like it was obsessed with hidden belief, right? So it's really trying to identify the false convert, the crypto Muslim, right? And this is important, like really key for contextualizing Las Casas, because he argued against forced conversion, right? And he was doing so like in a society already shaped by the fear that coercion produced inauthentic Christians, right? So the specter that was really haunting post-conquest Spain was not simply the non-Christian, but the converted Muslim who appeared Christian while remaining Muslim, right? And so Las Casas, like genuine conversion for him and being a Dominican required persuasion and free assent, not force, right? It's because if you force people to become Christian, you may produce, again, a Morisco. And we have to understand, in his youth, Las Casas marched with the Christian militia to crush a Muslim rebellion in Granada. Like he was part of the massacres. He saw forced conversions of the Muslims in Andalus and those that would become Moriscos, right? So this experience really stayed with him. So he knows or knew what like conquest looked like in the so-called old world, right? So when he saw Spanish conquistadors in the so-called New World using what he called like fire and sword to baptize indigenous people, he wasn't just seeing cruelty, right? The thing that he wrote down, Mamadou, which is really fascinating, he wrote down when they were forcibly converting indigenous peoples, he saw this as a Mohammedan heresy, right? This is what he wrote down. So he didn't see forced conversions of like Muslims and Jews as a Mohammedan heresy in Spain, right? Like this is what he called conquistadors doing to indigenous peoples, right? So like any bad act, he's like projecting his hatred of Islam to in that way, right? So for him, he's like, if you use violence to force conversion, you don't create a Christian, you create a Morisco, right? You create an inauthentic subject, right? And so he famously argued that spreading the gospel at sword point was to mimic, and he says like the vile methods of Islam and its prophet, peace be upon him. This is what he says. So to mimic the Muslim in the New World for him was to announce the arrival of the Antichrist. So when we understand this context, like his defense of indigenous peoples, it was not a rejection of empire, right? It was a strategy to ensure that Spanish empire didn't produce a New World version of the inauthentic crypto Muslim Morisco, right? So that's how you really got to like first contextualize him in that context. So true conversion for Las Casas couldn't be produced by terror. So if indigenous peoples encountered Christianity through like massacre, enslavement, and dispossession, he was sincerely thinking, again, through his Dominican orientation as well, he's like, how could someone like really possibly become truly Christian? Like, how could they really love the gospel, right? How could they distinguish the gospel and the teachings of Christianity from the violence of the Spaniards, right? Like he's like, how could they sincerely enter the church if the church derived as terror, right? And this doesn't mean that Las Casas was rejecting Spanish imperialism or even cruelty within itself. He was really trying to reform like the method of Christian empire. This is and imperialism, right? He wanted conversion to be sincere. It's not that he wanted to stop conversion. He's just like, look, indigenous peoples need to be incorporated into Christianity by the heart, right? And his concern was not the end of Spanish like Christian expansion. His concern was the theological and juridical form that expansion should take. And that juridical focus, again, is tied to his Dominican orientation that I mentioned in the previous episode.
Thank you for laying that out and masterfully detailing Las Casas, which pushes against dominant paradigms, which so many of us who have encountered Las Casas within our institutions of learning have come to become familiar with certain discourses around him. I think I want to move on to his legacy when it comes to, or his understanding of African slavery. So, because my understanding is that it somewhat complicates his image as defender of the oppressed. So do you mind telling our listeners, how did he come to understand, or what did he say about the enslaving of Africans?
Yeah, his relationship to enslavement of African peoples is one of the more controversial parts, and so of his legacy. And so early on, Las Casas petitioned the Spanish crown to import African peoples as slaves to the Americas. And his reasoning that he presented was he wanted to, quote, save indigenous peoples from the backbreaking labor of the mines. Later in life, then, so you have people condemn him for this. Okay. And then often a rejoinder that people will bring to defend him is that later in his life, he famously recanted. Okay. So he called the enslavement of African peoples like unjust, and he also called it tyrannical. Okay. And so then people try to save him and say, like, look, he's a defender of human rights and stuff, right? But if you look closer about why he recanted, it wasn't because he opposed Spanish imperialism or even the concept of enslavement itself. Like, this is really crucial, right? So slavery and suffering itself isn't the issue. The issue for him is that it's the obstacle that suffering creates for authentic conversion, again, to avoid creating like a crypto Morisco figure in the Americas, right? So he wasn't so much horrified by slavery and human suffering, but particularly, again, the method. And he reads and he accounts in his writings for Portuguese slave raids. And he accounts and he writes and describes like mothers torn from their children, people weeping, screaming into the heavens, and then he's reading these accounts and he's asking the reader almost rhetorically, he's like, what sincerity could they possibly have for Christianity, for people who have been so violently like stripped of their like liberty, right? And so again, his concern was the authenticity of the convert, right? He's like a man and woman in chains grieving their stolen child cannot undergo a sincere conversion of the heart. And if you don't get a sincere conversion of the heart, you get this really that looming problem that we've discussed, right? So it's important to note that Las Casas accepted what's called the papal donation, right? The idea that the Pope had the right to give the so-called New World to Spain, right? So he never wanted to end Spanish imperialism. He just wanted to marshal it or organize it differently. He wanted like an empire built on gentleness, because that was the only way to produce like a really authentic Christian for him. So even after he recanted on petition for enslaved African peoples, Las Casas did not become like, he wasn't some modern abolitionist. He didn't reject Spanish imperialism or respect indigenous sovereignty and difference, right? He remained till the end, right? Committed to the legitimacy of Spanish sovereignty in the Americas through these papal bulls, these papal donations. And so his position was not at all anti-slavery, anti-imperialist, right? It's this critique. He has a critique of method, unjust enslavement and violent conversion within a broader commitment to a Christian imperial expansion under the shadow of the Moriscos, right? And so what Las Casas goes on to argue, he's like, look, the church should not, like Spanish Christians shouldn't humiliate non-Christians or even destroy their idols. Right. And for those who defend Las Casas, they're like, look, this is like really humane. He, as opposed to many defenders of conquest. Right. But like, again, if you pay really like close attention to the logic in his writings, he's just like, look, if you destroy idols, it's not that indigenous sacred forms of life possess independent legitimacy for him. Like he's not saying that's why you don't destroy these idols. It's not like it's not because you respected their form of life. It's just the fact that if you humiliate and destroy their idols, in his views, he's like, you're just going to make conversion way harder, right? So it's like violence is rejected because it's evangelically counterproductive, right? So Spanish imperialism for Las Casas should expand in ways to not produce like hatred of Christianity. Right. And it's the idea that it should just be like, it should use gentleness, so people will like willingly accept this idea or like what he calls the gentle yoke of Christianity. Right. And so with this, it's like his form of Christianity is like more pastoral, like this idea of like a shepherd guiding a flock, and it's juridical. Right. It works through kindness, persuasion, and the reorganization of indigenous life around Christian truth. So with Las Casas, like he opposes spectacular physical violence, but he still participates in a structure that seeks to really completely transform indigenous life worlds and absorb indigenous peoples into a universal Christian history, right? So I think the thing that's important with him is like imperial violence. When we look at Las Casas, it's like, it's not always expressed through the sword, right? And often it appears more so like as like the notion that other ways of life possess no independent legitimacy and can only be understood as preparatory stages on the road to conversion. And the idea for Las Casas is like, if people impede conversion, if you impede the spreading of Christianity and the gospel, then you become rebellious. And he works through Aquinas, as him being a Dominican, to say if any indigenous peoples impede the spread of the gospel, then they're rebellious and they're legitimate candidates for destruction or death, right? So his ideas, it authorizes a continual expansion of Western imperialism in the Americas, because there's no way you can actually stop it, right? As soon as you try to, you're cast as rebellion again through this reading of Aquinas, and he makes this ontological distinction between the vincibly ignorant and the vincibly ignorant. I won't go into all of the details with that, but Las Casas, when put in this context, he's very much advancing Western imperialism.
Yeah, so I'll just say, like, if you can just summarize then, given what you put forward of Lacasas, what does it mean for how we read Lacasas today? Or how should we read Lacasas today? Just to kind of summarize that section.
Yeah, so we shouldn't read Las Casas as an early radical critic of empire, right? He wasn't. He was a Dominican theologian whose like every thought was shaped by the conquest of Andalus, right? He defended indigenous people so they wouldn't become a Morisco, essentially, and he advocated for the so-called like humane treatment of indigenous peoples, not as an end of itself, but as a prerequisite for like total, like sort of spiritual conquest, as it were. And so the indigenous like people in the Americas became defensible essentially because they weren't Muslim, right? Because they're not the Morisco, and they're not the willful enemy of Christ, right? They were the innocent potential convert. So with this, he like, when we look at the history, I think more broadly of colonial capitalist modernity, like we often focus on like the monsters or people that are easy targets, maybe like Columbus, Vespucci, Cortez, or like Sepulveda, people who like very openly spoke of gold and slaughter, and like Sepulveda talking about natural slaves. But Las Casas like really, I think, signals to us that the so-called like, quote unquote humane path, right, the path of the protector, it carries often the very same imperial logic expressed through like saving, right? A good somewhat contemporary like version of this, you could like Sarah Ferris's work on femonationalism. This logic of saving is still advances like Western imperialism and capitalism, right? So the conquest of Andalus and the Crusades, it didn't stay in the Mediterranean, it crossed the Atlantic, and what it has done is really shaped the definition of what it means to be human, what it means to be redeemable. And once we do that, it just becomes like much more difficult to tell comforting stories about empire becoming more humane over time, right? It's just important for us to be really attentive to how it really expresses itself, just in a different register, right? And just to end off this section, right, is like, I compared like modern evangelicals to Columbus, and I think when I think about Las Casas, he reminds me a lot of modern day liberals, right? So like Las Casas, like him, like liberals often reject the most brutal forms of domination and present themselves as like critical, like critics of excess and cruelty and dehumanization. But their solution is never to like to abandon the underlying structures of empire. They said they want to like humanize them, like reform them and render them more ethical, right? So, and I find like the modern liberal project often mirrors the logic of Las Casas, right? It's not conquest through the sword, but incorporation through rights, recognition, inclusion, dialogue, humanitarianism, reconciliation, right? And so the idea is like difference will be kind of tolerated, but only insofar as it could be accommodated within an existing imperialist order, right? So with this, like the problem that the other kind of presents is that they have to be like integrated and made legible to institutions that remain fundamentally unchanged, right? So like liberals today, they always like often position themselves as the conscious of empire, like Las Casas did, and like they, for the most part, like condemn like excess while just preserving its very foundations, right? And so I think that's like with Las Casas, not to create a simplistic straight line, but I think there's like some haunting parallels between the different figures and the logics that they carry forward, right?
Thank you. And in closing, what is a masterclass of an episode, so thank you. Columbus imagined like Spain to be this chosen instrument of divine history. But ultimately, Spain failed, right? So what happened to Spain? It didn't become a world hegemon. And what does this final irony reveal about prophecy and empire? Just to kind of put them together in closing.
Yeah, let me try to do it as quickly as I can. The like just absolute unheard of, like quantities of silver and gold and resources and labor extracted from the Americas through that appropriative relation. It really did, it enriched the Spanish crown, but they didn't generate like a productive transformation that would like later characterize the Dutch Republic in England. Much of its wealth ended up being consumed by imperial wars, debt repayments, and military expenditures. And when one can look at Origi to look at how these systemic cycles of accumulation function. I talked about them in the prior episode, right? And one of the big things that also really impacted Spain was because they expelled the Muslims and Jews, right? And what that did, it really deprived Spain of really important commercial, artisanal, and agricultural knowledge, right? So it really further weakened its productive foundations. And so, yeah, Spain doesn't consolidate a lasting hegemony. The commercial and financial networks opened by it through the Iberian Spanish expansion, it really did end up benefiting Dutch merchants and the Dutch, and later the English. And so Spain helped create the conditions for a new cycle of accumulation, but the center of accumulation it shifted elsewhere. And again, one can read Origi for that, right? And so I think I'll just end it off because it's a lot of information. Again, like we know imperialism, Western imperialism has endured, and I would just argue against like its theological horizons they weren't just like dropped through what we called last time like that secularization narrative, right? They're repeatedly reworked. The prophecies didn't disappear; they were just transformed and articulated into new imperial projects, right? So they transformed like this. The elements of this like redemptive imagination persist today, and I would argue with Christian Zionism, where you have geopolitical power, sacred history, and eschatological expectations, like they're fused together, right? So what I just hope ultimately is it's like I was able to, in some sense, just bring into view that theology just matters to the story, right? It's not simply a moral cover, but like really a generative force that we need to account for when discussing imperialism. I think that's like the main aim of these things.
Thank you so much, Prof. And once again, this is a masterclass, an episode that I encourage people to come back to and take notes. And hopefully this will give you enough of a bearing and background and a foundation for what will be the final and third episode in our series of the theological underpinnings of capitalist colonial modernity. So until next time, people, peace out.